When Marcus Aurelius wrote, "When you arise in the morning, think of what a precious privilege it is to be alive, to breathe, to think, to enjoy, to love," he wasn't writing for an audience. He wasn't building a brand. He wasn't trying to sound wise. He was doing something quieter and more serious than that. He was setting the posture of a man who understood that the first minutes of the day decide the texture of the rest of it, because the mind is easiest to govern before the world touches it. Some people wake up already in defense, not because their life is harder than everyone else's, not because they're uniquely burdened, but because they train themselves to begin in reaction. And reaction is a habit, and habits don't ask permission. They simply run. And by the time their feet hit the floor, the day already owns them. The inbox already owns them. The notifications already own them. Other people's urgency already owns them. And they call that normal because it's common. But common has never been the same thing as strong. There's an unnamed way of moving through the world that doesn't announce itself, because it doesn't need witnesses, and the men who live this way don't wake up reaching for noise. They wake up reaching for clarity, not because they're perfect, not because they're immune to stress, but because they've seen what happens when the gates are left open, and they got tired of paying for that mistake. It isn't about becoming emotionless, it's about becoming unbuyable. It's about beginning the day with the kind of internal posture that makes the external world negotiate with you instead of controlling you. The kind of posture where peace isn't a mood you hope arrives, it's a territory you guard. The kind of posture where focus isn't a motivational concept, it's a weapon. And the separation is always obvious once it's seen, because most people live like passengers inside their own mornings, dragged by the weather of the world, dragged by someone else's tone, dragged by a headline designed to poison attention, dragged by the invisible pressure to respond, to explain, to prove, to keep up, to perform a version of competence that looks busy. Other people don't do that. They may not even have the language for it. They just know, somewhere deep, that the day is a battlefield for attention. And if attention is lost early, it rarely returns cleanly. It returns scattered. It returns irritated. It returns hungry. And hunger creates mistakes in every arena. Some men are built for reaction because reaction feels like life. It feels like movement. It feels like being needed. It feels like being involved. Other men are built for waiting, for watching, for choosing, and they don't look impressive to people addicted to speed, because restraint doesn't advertise itself, but restraint is the root of everything real. The reactive mind believes the day happens to him. The governed mind understands the day as something he meets, something he shapes, not by controlling events, but by controlling his relationship to events. And that is where Stoicism stops being quotes and becomes a way of breathing. You can see it in the first thought. Most people wake up with a complaint, even if they don't say it out loud, even if it's subtle, even if it's just a sigh, because their mind starts by counting what's missing. A governed man starts by recognizing what's already present, not as optimism, not as denial, but as accuracy, because it is a privilege to be alive. And a man who forgets that becomes careless with his time, careless with his energy, careless with his attention, and he starts spending his mornings like they're infinite, which is how men slowly lose their edge without realizing it. There's a certain type of man who begins the day with responsibility, not the heavy kind that feels like shame, but the clean kind that feels like authorship. The kind that says, without drama, the way today feels will not be outsourced to traffic, to weather, to emails, to someone else's bad mood. Because the only real freedom a man has is the space between stimulus and response. And men who live by that space end up with a calm other people can't explain. They don't blame themselves for what happens. They simply refuse to give what happens permission to own them. They understand peace is not a public park. Peace is a fortress. And fortress thinking is not soft, it's not delicate, it's not spiritual fluff. It's discipline, it's gatekeeping, it's knowing that if the gate is open to everything, then everything will enter. Criticism, worry, jealousy, urgency, fear, and a man will spend the whole day cleaning up an internal mess he allowed in at sunrise. So they guard the gate, not by pretending problems don't exist, but by refusing to let problems become identity. Nothing disturbs their peace without permission, And that doesn't mean nothing touches them. It means nothing commands them. It means the outside world doesn't get to reach into the inside world and rearrange everything like it owns the place. The Stoics were brutal about this, not brutal in tone, brutal in clarity, because clarity is brutal to the ego, and the ego wants excuses. A man can't control the economy. A man can't control other people. A man can't control the past. A man can't control the next headline. A man can't control whether today brings friction, but a man can control his attention, his choices, his actions, his effort, his response. And when a man focuses only on what is his, anxiety loses oxygen, because most anxiety comes from trying to hold what cannot be held. You can feel the difference when you meet someone who lives this way. They're not frantic. They don't constantly check things like a nervous tick. They don't treat their phone like a leash. They don't talk like they're drowning. They move with a slower center. They don't need to win every moment. They don't need to be right in every conversation. They don't need to correct every misunderstanding. They keep their energy inside the circle of control, and that makes them look almost dangerous to people who live by impulse, because a controlled man is hard to manipulate. And then there's the deeper separation, the one most men don't admit out loud, the way they measure worth. The reactive mind wakes up and places his worth on trial immediately, like the day is a judge, like the outcomes of the next 12 hours will decide whether he deserves respect, whether he deserves peace, whether he deserves to feel good about himself. So he chases outcomes like they're oxygen. He needs the win, the validation, the message, the deal, the clean day, the perfect routine, because without it, he doesn't just feel disappointed, he feels exposed. The Stoics cut through that illusion with one quiet truth. Outcomes come and go, character remains, and a man who ties his self-worth to what happens today is volunteering for a life of emotional slavery, because today will not always cooperate, and the world does not exist to preserve a man's self-image. The men who last, in life and in markets and in war and in marriage and in leadership, are the men who separate effort from identity, who can want success without needing it to feel worthy, who can take a loss without turning it into a personal verdict. That posture is rare, and the rare part becomes even clearer when the mirror shows up, because trading is a mirror. Not because it's mystical, not because it's glamorous, but because it compresses consequence, and whatever is unstable inside a man becomes visible fast. A man can read Marcus Aurelius and still wake up reactive. A man can quote Epictetus and still click like a gambler. A man can talk about focus and still spend the first hour of the day letting charts, news, notifications, and other people's urgency drag him into the same storm. In trading, this is where the same morning patterns repeat under a different name. The market becomes the inbox. The chart becomes the notification. The P&L becomes the judge. And the man who cannot guard his morning cannot guard his execution. He tells himself he'll be calm today, but then price moves and the old reflex rises, and he finds himself checking, adjusting, forcing, chasing, micromanaging, because his peace was never owned. It was borrowed, and borrowed peace evaporates the moment pressure arrives. That's why strategy isn't the center. CLS is never the real issue when a man has no gate, because a man without a gate will sabotage any edge. He will turn a good setup into a bad trade by entering from emotion. He will turn a decent day into a revenge spiral by tying worth to outcome. He will turn patience into suffering because his nervous system is addicted to stimulation. So the morning becomes the first trade of the day, even if no trade is taken. The first minutes are the first execution. The first choice is whether the man will act or merely intend. And that's another line that divides men cleanly, because intention is everywhere. Intention is cheap. Intention is a fantasy that feels productive, and many men spend years living on intention, because intention never risks failure, but action risks exposure. Action risks being wrong, action risks not being rewarded, and the ego hates unrewarded action. Marcus Aurelius had to talk himself out of bed because even an emperor could feel resistance, and the men who understand this don't shame themselves for resistance. They simply refuse to worship it. They understand that doing what a man was born to do does not require perfect emotion. It requires decision, and decision becomes identity when it's repeated. So a certain type of man begins his day with a simple inner agreement. Today will not be a day of mere planning. Today will contain action, not frantic action, not compulsive action, but aligned action. The kind of action that doesn't beg for motivation. Because motivation is a weather pattern. Discipline is climate. And there is a particular masculine peace that appears when a man no longer negotiates with mood, when he no longer waits to feel like it, when he no longer needs the universe to give him a perfect emotional runway before he behaves like himself. I mean, some men live their mornings like they're waiting for inspiration. Other men live their mornings like they're reporting for duty, not to anyone else, but to their own standard. This is where the hunter mentality fits cleanly into Stoicism, because the hunter is not frantic. He doesn't sprint at every sound. He doesn't fire because he's bored. He doesn't confuse movement with progress. He waits, he watches, he measures. And when the moment is correct, the action is simple, quiet, inevitable. That's focus, that's peace, that's the gate working. And when challenges arrive, as they always do, the reactive mind treats them as punishment, as proof life is unfair, as confirmation the day is bad. And that interpretation becomes self-fulfilling, because a man who believes he is being punished starts behaving like a victim, even if he would never use that word. The Stoic posture is different, not optimistic, not naive, but forged. What stands in the way becomes the way, and that line isn't poetry, it's mechanics, because friction reveals weakness, and weakness revealed is an opportunity to become stronger. And the men who grow fastest are not the ones with the easiest days. They're the ones who refuse to waste difficulty. They don't pray for easier. They become harder to break. They don't romanticize pain. They use it. And that is where the morning statements become more than words, because the purpose was never affirmation for its own sake. The purpose was alignment with reality. The purpose was to meet the day as it is, not as the ego wishes it was. A man who begins with gratitude doesn't become blind to problems. He becomes harder to manipulate. He stops letting his mind default to complaint. And complaint is a subtle addiction, because complaint makes a man feel righteous while staying powerless. And powerful men don't need complaint to feel alive. Gratitude is not softness. Gratitude is vision. It's the ability to see what is already good without needing perfection as a condition for peace. It's noticing breath, noticing thought, noticing the simple fact of being here. Because being here is not guaranteed. And a man who remembers that does not start his day like a spoiled consumer demanding entertainment from the world. He starts his day like a steward of his own time. And then there's the poison most men drink every morning without realizing it. Comparison. They wake up and look sideways, they measure, they scroll. They judge their behind the scenes against someone else's curated surface. And that creates a low-grade resentment that ruins focus. Because a man who is secretly competing with everyone is never fully present in his own lane. The governed man doesn't hate other people's success. He doesn't need to tear anyone down. He simply doesn't measure his timing against theirs, because timing is personal. And a man who understands the long game stops panicking about being behind, because behind is often an illusion created by looking at someone else's highlight reel. He returns to the only comparison that matters, not out loud, not as a slogan, but as a quiet internal audit. Am I moving with more discipline than yesterday? Am I less reactive than yesterday? Am I more precise than yesterday? Am I more responsible than yesterday? Am I ending the day with more control than I began it? Because that final posture is what separates men who change from men who merely age. The day doesn't need to be perfect. The day needs to be used. And the men who live this way treat every day as a contract, not to hustle, not to grind, not to perform intensity, but to become slightly sharper, slightly calmer, slightly more honest, slightly more aligned. Because that compounding is what builds the unshakable life the Stoics were really pointing toward. In trading terms, it's the same. The man who ends the session better than he started doesn't require a green day to feel stable. He requires clean execution. He requires a regulated mind. He requires discipline that doesn't depend on outcome. He can lose and still respect himself. He can win and still stay humble. He can do nothing and still feel like a man, because his worth is not measured by constant motion. That's the hunter. That's the Stoic. And not everyone will understand this because most people are trained to live externally, trained to outsource peace to conditions, trained to require the world to be kind before they can be calm. But some men understand instantly because they've always felt the cost of waking up reactive, and they're tired of it. And when something lands that describes it clearly, it doesn't feel like advice. It feels like recognition. If this hits, comment Hunter. Not to announce anything, just to mark the moment you recognize the pattern. And if it feels like you, the real you, the you that's done beginning the day owned by other people's urgency, hit like. If you want more of this stoic, hunter-minded framing that keeps the mind clean in the morning and stable under pressure, subscribe, not as a pledge, not as a badge, just so the signal stays close when the noise gets loud. Because once a man sees the gate, he starts noticing every time he leaves it open. Once he sees the difference between intention and action, he starts getting embarrassed by how often he used intention as a hiding place. Once he sees that worth is not on trial every day, he stops trading, working, and living like he's begging the world for validation. Once he sees that peace is permission-based, he stops selling it for cheap. And after that, some paths close quietly behind him. He doesn't make a speech. He doesn't announce a transformation. He just stops waking up like a passenger. He starts waking up like a man. Comment Hunter if this hits.